called pitfalls of intention researchers. And these are perhaps the problems that you don't necessarily see coming. So let's get stuck in. As I understand it, we've probably got a mix of people today. Maybe some of you are early career researchers. Maybe some of you have had slightly longer careers in research to date. I imagine that all of you are pretty well versed in some of those more common ethical matters like plagiarism. For the grad students among you, you might have had workshops or lectures on Turnitin for writing up essays as part of your courses. Some of you may even be aware of paper mills and those more obviously malicious intentional breaches in publishing ethics or scientific conduct. But today I'm going to be talking about the things that honest researchers often get wrong. Journal editors are on the lookout for quality content, but importantly, and unfortunately, they also have to be on the lookout for fraudulent or unethical work. So to give your work the best chance of success, you want to make sure that you don't inadvertently misrepresent your work or give editors any reason to doubt the reliability of your findings. And some of these may take a bit of due diligence to work around, but I'm happy to say that these pitfalls are all very easily avoidable. So without further ado, let's dive straight into pitfall number 10. And this is about missing research integrity documentation. When planning your research and then drafting your study, there are quite a few important things to include, and these need particular care for those of you working with human participants or animal subjects. So if it comes to research agreements, we'll be looking for having the correct materials or data agreements in place, protocols and IRB approvals, clinical trial registration, for instance, and patient consent, both to be included in the study and to be included in the publication itself of those results. When it comes to authorship, you'll need to establish authorship order, make sure that you correctly include authorship affiliations and funding sources. Your journal may require you to include a credit or an ICMJE statement listing authorship contributions. And you may also be required to fill out a conflict of interest or declaration statement. For copyright permissions, if your work includes a reproduction of an already published figure or table, you'll need to ensure that you have the rights to reproduce that. And for peer review, depending on the peer review policy of the journal, you may need to provide anonymized files. So when planning your research and drafting your study, there's quite a few things that you need to include. And as always, I would say it's really important to check the guide for authors to review any specific requirements around inclusion of ethical statements, criterion for authorship, and conflict of interest declarations. And there's a lot to think about here, but there are also some resources to make this task a little easier. If you've heard of the Equator Network, it's a group of field experts that have come together to define the minimum set of information that each group needs to provide to undertake and publish a particular kind of study. And they've developed reporting guidelines for the most common study types and clinical areas, especially for particular outcomes and methods that are often incorrectly reported. So for instance, here you can see an example guideline in their library on the Equator Network, which is all about reporting meta-epidemiological methodology research. So if you're planning to conduct a similar study, you could find guidance on best practice and what kind of documentation you would need to include and have in place before the study began. Our own policies may vary from journal to journal, but we expect that human and animal studies would follow applicable ethical standards, which includes compliance with the Helsinki Agreement and ARRIVE guidelines, respectively, as well as adhering to local regulations. We also require approval from an ethics committee local to where the investigation took place for such studies. So please be sure that these approvals are in place not just for publication, but suitably in time for recruitment and commencement of the study. Along with ethical statements, people can often trip up when making appropriate declarations around conflicts of interest, which is something I briefly touched upon on one of my previous slides. A conflict of interest or a competing interest is a set of conditions in which the professional judgment of an author, in this example, concerning a primary interest, such as the validity of research, may be influenced by a secondary interest, such as financial gain. A declaration of interest or a disclosure statement is a statement from that author that there is no financial, personal interest or belief that could affect their objectivity, or if there is, it would state the source and nature of that potential conflict. Reviewers, and other editors as well, must also disclose conflicts of interest as well as the authors, and that might be being from the same institution as the authors, prior working or co-authorship relationships. Many Elsevier journals use our declaration tool, and this helps authors step by step through the process of preparing well-considered and ICMJE compliant declarations. I should say here, in case this is an acronym that isn't familiar to everyone, that ICMJE stands for the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors and has a lot of best practice for publishing guidelines. So this helps authors disclose any potential conflicts of interest, such as financial or non-financial research support, recent relationships, such as advisory positions or consultations, or relevant patents or IP rights. It's important to say at this point that potential conflicts of interest do not necessarily prohibit publication. They often don't, in fact. Rather, it's important to be transparent about them so that the journal editor, reviewers, and readers can be aware of whether any undue bias may have affected the impartiality of your conclusions. If there's a possibility that this is the case, they may want to discuss this point with you before your manuscript progresses. So please do be honest with these. It's in your best interest to do so. Now, conflicts of interest can take many forms. So I wonder if you could possibly consider this scenario, and maybe if Benny can help me with this a little bit, maybe post your answers in the chat, and Benny, you can kind of give me a pulse on what the spread of answers that come in are. I know we've got a big group today, so I hope this isn't going to be too busy or chaotic. So who thinks that these would be a conflict of interest? So number one, we have a university researcher who owns stock in a large oil company and conducts an experiment on the environmental effects of oil drilling. At number two, we have a researcher who submits an article to a journal for which the editor-in-chief is a professor in the researcher's department. And number three, a clinical researcher who's writing a review of current and emerging treatments for a particular medical condition and excludes mention of a new treatment because it does not align with personal religious beliefs. So if you could pop into the chat, who thinks that which of these may be a conflict of interest? And I'm going to pause for a moment here.
Anyone want to try? You can type it in the chat box.
I'll give a minute longer, otherwise I'll go ahead. I've got some more scenarios that people can take part in later on. So does anyone have any thoughts on which of 1, 2, and 3 may be theorized?
I'm sorry that the chat is disabled, so you all can try to answer in the
okay.
in the Q&A. Yeah.
That's all right. People can either go into the Q&A, otherwise I'm just going to ask you to be responsible and use your own time to consider these and be honest with yourselves about whether you got them right. Okay, I'm going to move on now to say that actually these can all potentially represent conflicts of interest. So as long as you're honest about them and declare them and allow the editors and reviewers to assess whether it's likely to have unduly influenced the work, it may not be a problem. But there are a few different examples that conflicts of interest might include. So here, as we say, we've got direct financial conflicts of interest, indirect financial conflicts of interest, career and intellectual relationships, institutional and personal belief. So if in doubt, do include these. Okay, now coming in at number 8, the next pitfall we have is all about matters of authorship. So you may have very clear ideas on where you would feature on the author list of your paper. Your supervisor or your collaborators may think a bit differently, however. It's really important that you decide the order of authors well in advance of submitting your article for publication. But how do you decide this? So I've got another scenario here that I'd like you all to consider. If anyone would like to put the answers in the Q&A, please do go ahead. Otherwise, I'll just give you a moment to think about it before I tell you the answers. So in this scenario, a researcher has just completed her paper. Who do we think should be an author on the paper? Let's presume that she will be an author. But in addition to herself, we also have her advisor, who she consulted for guidance on the experiment, the data analysis, and writing and revising the final article. We also have a professor at a different institution who assisted her in analysing just the data, a lab assistant who helped her prepare the experimental design and maintained and operated the equipment, and then we have 2 fellow grad students who read her paper and edited it, but they didn't have a hand in the experiment. So again, I'm going to pause here and say you can take a minute to think about who you think would be an author on this paper. So generally, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but the only people that we would definitely expect to be authors on this particular paper would be the researcher herself and her advisor. The others, it could go either way, but we'd probably expect that they end up in the acknowledgement section rather than the author byline. But it's not always that simple, and there are some guidelines around this too. So let's dig a little deeper. ICJME, again, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, recommends that authorship should be based on meeting all of these 4 criteria. Number 1, substantially contributing to the conception and design or acquisition of data or analysis and interpretation of the data. Drafting the article and revising it critically for important intellectual content. Giving their approval of the final version to be published, and to agree to be held accountable for all aspects of the work in ensuring research integrity questions are investigated and resolved, should they arise. So really, an author should qualify in all 4 of these areas. I should note that if someone has fulfilled criteria number 1 here and substantially contributed to the work in these ways, they should be invited to partake in criteria number 2 and 3 and 4. So what I mean by this is, if someone has the potential to qualify for an author because of their contributions, it wouldn't be right to simply leave them out of the email thread where you draft and revise the manuscript or not share the final manuscript proofs with them. They should be able to participate in those criteria and demonstrate their eligibility for authorship. So first authors, and this may vary from field to field, but this is most typically what we see. A first author would usually be the person who conducts and/or supervises data analysis, presentation, and interpretation of the results, and is often the person that puts together that paper and submits it. And the co-authors tend to be people who make intellectual contributions to data analysis and interpretation. They'll be reviewing every paper draft, but they should also be able to present the results, defend the implications, and discuss any limitations. Including someone as an author who does not meet these basic authorship criteria is a breach of ethical policy. Someone should only be included if they have seen and approved the final version of the manuscript being submitted, and who can, if needed, take public responsibility for the article's contents. Authorship should not be gifted to help out a colleague or a student, and it definitely shouldn't be purchased. Unfortunately, this is a scenario we see at times where people see adverts on social media for papers that are undergoing peer review with authorship positions for sale. Please don't do this. If we see late-stage author changes on a manuscript, we will ask you to demonstrate that your involvement in the work was substantial and that it predates submission. So don't be tempted by this. We do look into these sorts of queries, and if verified, it could result in really some quite severe consequences as listed here. And if you and your colleagues get into an argument mid-submission or post-publication about who should be an author, who should be where on the authorship byline, it can result in delays to your work getting published, expressions of concern on the work if it's already published, or other corrections to the record, which could affect yours and your co-author's reputation. So do think carefully and make sure that everyone agrees to their authorship positions before you submit the paper. Pitfall number 7 is compliance with generative AI policies. Quite a hot topic. This is fairly new as our policies go, given the leaps and bounds made in this field of late. And I want to begin this by saying that ChatGPT cannot be listed as an author. It can't take responsibility for the work. There are some ways in which generative AI can be used legitimately when drafting up your manuscript, but care needs to be taken here. And I'm going to tell you a bit more about the policies and guidelines that we've made available to authors, editors, and reviewers. So as I said, in the last year, we've launched a set of policies for authors, editors, and reviewers specifically in response to generative AI. Elsevier is going to be monitoring ongoing developments in this area closely, and will adjust or refine our policies as appropriate, as we appreciate that this is a rapidly changing space. Our policy page features frequently asked questions, or an FAQ section, which we're going to continue to refresh as questions, concerns come from the community. These policies can be found on Elsevier's publishing ethics page, detailed at the bottom of this slide, and I'd really encourage you to take a look at these. So let's take a look at the Gen AI policy for authors. It's important to note that this policy refers to the use of Gen AI in writing process, not in the research process. The policy states that authors should only use Gen AI to improve language and readability, to apply it with human oversight and control, as it can generate authoritative sounding text that may in fact be biased, incorrect, or incomplete. Authors should disclose the use of Gen AI in the paper by adding a statement to the manuscript saying what tool has been used, what version it is, and how it has been used in the manuscript. And they shouldn't list Gen AI as a co-author or cite it as an author. When submitting your manuscript and editorial manager as an author at any of our journals, you'll now be prompted by a pop-up which asks you to confirm whether or not you've used Gen AI in the drafting of your manuscript and to complete the relative disclosure statement template if so. Information about the policy and disclosure instructions have been added to the guide for authors in each of our journals for easy reference. The Gen AI policy for reviewers and editors focuses on protecting authors' rights. So any manuscript that is submitted to one of our journals must be treated as a confidential document, and therefore it can't be uploaded into an AI tool because this may violate authors' confidentiality, proprietary and/or privacy rights. The same goes for other documents that may contain any information about the paper or the author, which includes the peer review report and any editorial notification or decision letters. So if you're acting as a reviewer, it's not acceptable to run your reviewer report through Gen AI tools, even if it's just for language editing, because unfortunately they may breach confidential details of that author's paper. Lastly, generative AI should not be used to assist in the review, evaluation, or decision-making process. Reviewing a scientific manuscript or managing its editorial evaluation implies responsibilities that can only be attributed to humans. Therefore, reviewers and editors are responsible and accountable for these processes. We also have a policy for the use of Gen AI in artwork. It states that we don't allow the use of Gen AI to create or alter images in submitted manuscripts. The only exception is when AI is used as part of the research design or methods, as in this case, there are cases where certain research fields, such as biomedical imaging, may require these sorts of tools. And in those cases, we require a full disclosure in the methods section. The use of Gen AI in production of artwork is not permitted generally. It may be allowed in some exceptional cases, like for creating journal covers, but only if prior permission from the journal is obtained, all rights have been obtained for the material, and the content is correctly attributed. If in doubt, please check with the handling editor who will assess whether the proposed artwork satisfies these criteria. And while we're on the subject of artwork, we can move on to pitfall number 6. Number 6 is image manipulation. It sounds pretty bad, and it often is. You'd be surprised, however, how many people unintentionally stumble into these issues. There are legitimate ways to alter your images used in your figures. If we take the example of a Western blot shown here, a common technique in molecular biology, it's perfectly acceptable to adjust the brightness, contrast, or color balance of an image for reasons of clarity, but only as long as these changes are applied evenly to the whole image and as long as they do not obscure or eliminate any information in the original. You can't change the brightness or contrast in order to hide bands or artifacts, such as the image on the far left here, where the contrast levels have been scaled up so high that an entire row of fainter bands disappears, which might have had important implications on the results of that study. You can't selectively remove features from the image, such as the band being blurred out in example number 2 with a smart fill eraser tool. And you can't splice or add in features from a different image, as in the example on the right, or use image alterations to disguise them. In this third example, someone's adjusted the contrast levels, which allows us to see that the second lane has actually been copied and pasted in from another blot. Only use what edits are necessary for clarity. We do use image forensics tools to identify irregularities and duplications within figures, so please don't be tempted to prettify your data. Next up on this whistle-stop tour of pitfalls is number 5, data falsification. While we've seen some examples of improper use of AI to generate fabricated results in image form, data manipulation can range from tampering with data sets in Excel, skewing results towards more favorable outcomes in support of hypotheses, to falsifying error bars and statistical analyses. This unethical practice undermines the integrity of scientific research, and it can have serious negative consequences both for the scientific community and society at large. A very practical example can come from Andrew Wakefield's MMR vaccine study in 1998, which falsely claimed a link between the measles, mumps, and rubella MMR vaccine and autism. This led to a decline in vaccination rates and subsequent outbreaks of preventable diseases, putting the health of many individuals, especially children, at risk. The cumulative impact of data falsification cases erodes trust in science and academia, which are built on the foundation of truth, integrity, and unbiased research. This can also lead to public skepticism, undermining the credibility of experts and scientific findings. Our next pitfall at number 4 focuses on plagiarism and textual overlap. I'm sure most of you would know that literal copying or verbatim copying of someone else's work, word for word, without citation, is plagiarism. Straightforward. But what about text recycling or self-plagiarism or paraphrasing? While paraphrasing and text recycling may seem more innocuous, there are compelling reasons why we discourage these practices, even when authors are drawing from their own work. The best researchers endeavour to bring new and innovative ideas to their field, promoting originality and creativity. Reusing content without adding new insight can reduce the impact of work, and unacknowledged reuse of existing ideas can mislead readers into thinking the ideas are novel when they're not. Authors need to transparently acknowledge the origins of ideas. If an article is found to have been excessively plagiarized via these methods, it can result in rejection or retraction of the work. When we evaluate suspected plagiarism, 2 key factors come into play. Firstly, did the author acknowledge the prior work? And secondly, is the overlap substantial? That is, looking at the extent and substance of the overlap. I have another question for you that I'd like you to consider. Do you think it's acceptable to reuse your own published text in the methods section of a paper that you're writing? And how does this compare to how acceptable it would be to reuse your own text within a results, discussion, or conclusions section? It is up to the editor's discretion, but the methods section is usually the one section where textual overlap is more tolerated, provided you can clearly reference the original article. Overlap in the results discussion or conclusions are less accepted because it might suggest a lack of originality or novelty with the work presented in the paper at hand. Many editors would also argue that the introduction should contain minimal overlap with previous works, as the introduction is meant to set the scene for this current body of research. That is, what gaps were filled in this paper comparative to prior approaches. But being practical, we understand that there's really only so many ways that you can write up how to perform a Western blot, which is why when it comes to the methods section, it's generally okay to reuse certain text, as long as it's not a purely methods paper. So please do give some thought to what sources your work pulls from and how you might make that clear before submitting. Similar to Turnitin used in the academic setting, all submissions to Elsevier journals are run through Authenticate. Editors can review the similarity check report, which compares text in your manuscript to other publications, websites, etc., and color codes any sections of your text which have a match to other sources. We utilize these reports to help gauge quantity and quality of textual overlap. Sometimes when concerns of paraphrasing or plagiarism are raised with authors for whom English is not their native language, they provide an explanation for their actions by saying that they simply wanted to express admiration for the eloquence of the originating author's explanation. I should tell you that this probably isn't going to work. We appreciate the challenges that are present for non-native English speakers, and we may recommend use of a professional language editing service before progressing to peer review. As generative AI tools become more popular, authors may also elect to use these tools to improve the English language of their manuscript. However, as with any language editing software or service, it's important that the authors carefully review the suggested edits to ensure the underlying meaning of their manuscript is not altered. As an additional point of caution, paper mills have often utilized spin bots to assist with paraphrasing. However, this leads to the introduction of a few nonsensical and occasionally humorous phrases, some examples of which are shown here. So if you were translating the phrase random forest, which refers to a fairly specific statistical analysis technique, it may use synonyms to recreate that as arbitrary backwards. Arbitrary may be a synonym for random, backwards may be a synonym for forest, but arbitrary backwards does not mean anything in statistical context. Similarly, k-means clustering has been appearing in papers as a synonym for k implies bunching. Apologies, the other way around, k applies bunching has been occurring instead of k means clustering. These tortured phrases, as they're so called, are often picked up by Guillaume Cabinac's problematic paper screener and then are often highlighted on PubPeer. So if these sorts of phrases appear and you as authors haven't been able to recognize and remove them if you've been using these sorts of sources, then you can expect people to kick up a bit of a fuss once they find them. Pitfall number 3 is about duplicate and simultaneous submissions. Manuscripts presenting the same research should not be published more than once. the author has a responsibility to ensure that they are submitting original work. By submitting and resubmitting unoriginal work, an author is wasting the editor's and reviewer's time while not advancing knowledge in their field. Duplication of papers across journals in different languages should usually be avoided as well for the same reasons. However, it can be acceptable to have an article translated into other languages to broaden reach, provided permission is sought from the original journal and duly acknowledged in the translated journal. Slicing one's research work into smaller sub-papers is also a manipulation of the research and publishing process. But what about simultaneous submissions? Can you submit your paper to multiple journals at the same time? The answer to that is no. When you submit your paper, in addition to certifying that it has not been previously published, you also ascribe that it is not under consideration for publication elsewhere. Aside from redundancy in peer review and editorial resources, if both papers get accepted and published, we find ourselves with duplicate publications, which breaches publishing ethics. Once version of record and copyright has been sorted between the affected journals, at least one of the papers would need to be retracted, which can have negative consequences on you and the journal's reputations. But what if I've shared my paper on a preprint server? Would that be considered duplicate publication? And again, the answer here is no. Elsevier's policy allows for responsible sharing on preprint servers. Best practices would be to fully disclose the preprint during the submission process if you submitted that full research paper to a formal journal after the fact. This means that editors would be aware that the preprint was out there, which can be important. If they're using authenticate checks to look for text similarity within an article, it may highlight that some of that text has already been found online in a different source. And if that's a preprint, it'll help ensure that the editors do not believe that you've plagiarized your own work. So if you've used a preprint server with your work previously, do mention this in your covering letter and it won't be a problem. Citation manipulation. While citation manipulation on the part of the author, that is, adding in every paper you've ever published into your reference list, would counter probably the well-intentioned premise of this countdown of ethical pitfalls, it is true that well-intentioned researchers may be put into some unethical situations, such as in the example presented here. So I'm going to read this to you. This is a letter sent to the authors during the peer review process by the editor-in-chief. And it says, "Dear author, thank you for submitting your paper to journal ABCD." I'm going to say this isn't a real acronym here, just in case anyone's wondering. "I've completed my evaluation of your manuscript. The reviewers recommend reconsideration of your manuscript following minor revision and modification. Your paper is likely to be accepted, pending all the changes are made as indicated below, editor-in-chief." And then we have reviewer one's comments. "The authors have failed to mention the below leading papers. I strongly recommend that the author includes the references listed below." And then we've got a list of 5 different references across what looks to be 3 different journals. So I'd like you to take a moment here to consider, do you see any red flags in this email? And if so, do you see none? Do you see 1, 2, 3 or more? So I would actually highlight 4 red flags from both the reviewer and the editor-in-chief in journal ABCD. And I'm going to talk through each of these, but let's start with the blue box here. So this demonstrates something we would call citation stacking, or it may do. In this case, the reviewer recommends a series of publications. You'll probably find that the reviewer is a co-author on quite a few of these. In other cases, those papers may not be published by the reviewer themselves, but they may be published by people within that reviewer's network, a close collaborator perhaps. The second red flag is this green box here, which is quite a generic mention or reference to the leading papers in this field, but it doesn't really specifically indicate why the referee feels that these works should be included. You know, why is a lack of inclusion of these papers a problem? And where specifically in the paper does the reviewer think that these papers should be included? A bit more detail here would probably aid some legitimacy to the suggestions that the reviewer has given. The third red flag, citation coercion, comes potentially here from the part of the editor in implying that the references must be included in order to be considered for publication. Our general policy is that editors should not alter referee comments. So if this is what reviewer 1 said, then they shouldn't be changing that. However, the editor should provide clarification in their decision letters to the authors as to which of the recommendations should be taken under consideration. In this scenario, the editor should have indicated that the authors may review the suggested references. However, they're not obligated to add them unless they agree with their relevance to the paper. The fourth red flag represents a second type of citation stacking, in which the editor and the reviewer may be working together to artificially inflate the impact factor of the journal, given that 3 of these references are all papers published in the journal article at hand. So you'll see that A, B, C, and D, the journal acronym, appears in 3 of these DOIs and is the journal where the paper has been submitted. And this could indicate that the reviewer and the editor are trying to boost ABCD's impact factor. I should say, these are only red flags. They don't definitely mean that these reviewers and editors are breaching ethical policies intentionally, but it's cause for concern or caution at the very least. It could be that reviewer 1 has included these 5 references because even though they happen to be at journal ABCD, and even if they happen to include the reviewer's name, maybe they really are just incredibly relevant to this paper and worthwhile including. I would say if you're acting as a reviewer and you feel that way about papers from your own journal or that are papers you yourself have authored, please do, if possible, try and include some other references in that list to spread the scope of literature across your field rather than just presenting those from which you would directly benefit. And indeed, the editor, as I said, should make clear to the author that these do not necessarily have to be included. So as an author, what are your rights in this situation? Are you required to add in these references? And the answer here is no. If you suspect editor-reviewer collusion or citation stacking by a reviewer or editor, you can flag this with the journal manager, who will help escalate it to the publisher of the journal for formal investigation. My team frequently supports with investigating these sorts of matters, and we do so in a very impartial way. So please don't be afraid to let us know if these things are happening. We want to know and correct them. And finally, we reach pitfall number 10. You should be aware that there is, unfortunately, a more malicious side to the publishing industry. There are what is known as predatory journals, who often try and entice inexperienced or naive authors into submitting work to them with promises of guaranteed acceptance or incredibly fast publication, but they often have hidden or unclear author fees, extremely inadequate or even absent peer review. There are things that you can look out for here, though, to be sure that you're submitting to a legitimate journal. I'm going to go through some of these with a bit of care. So firstly, you could look at the journal's website. It might contain misleading or false information on indexing. It might mimic another journal or publisher's site, or it may have no past or recent journal content for you to look through. The journal name could be the same as or easily confused with that of another journal. For instance, most new journals, when they're set up, would always endeavor to use a new acronym that hasn't been used to a similar journal in a similar field or any journal. But if a journal has an identical acronym to one that's maybe well known in the field, that could be a red flag. It could be that the journal is trying to pretend to be the other journal in order to accidentally catch some submissions. The peer review process may not be mentioned on the website at all. Manuscript acceptance or a very short peer review time may be guaranteed. When you look at the editorial board of these journals, it should provide full names and affiliations, as well as contact information for the editorial office. If those are missing, it may implicate that the journal is pretending that people are on its editorial board who are not actually involved with the journal. You may also see that the editor of their editorial board, they may be an editor on many other journals. Again, not always a problem, but if it may indicate that their name is being used without their knowledge. And this is especially problematic if you see that an editor appears on the journal board for journals in unrelated fields. The fees for publication may not be stated or explained very clearly on the journal website. This is a big one. This is probably one of the most common that we see. They may not be explained in the submission system, and it may be that those fees are only revealed to you at the point of an acceptance letter as a condition of acceptance. You may also see that there are no policies on publishing ethics. So there won't be any policies dictating who should qualify for authorship or contributorship, data sharing and reproducibility statements, intellectual property, ethical oversights, conflicts of interest, policies for corrections or retractions or appealing decisions. Journals that respect ethical policies will have these in place so that you know where you stand. A predatory journal may not bother to include these, because if they don't have rigorous quality control, they're unlikely to be taking a high view of publication ethics. So as I said, individually, these may not necessarily mean a journal is bad. Many journals can offer very fast publication because they've got workflows built around that, and it doesn't mean that the publications, the works that they publish are any lower quality. But you should be wary that together, these factors can add up to somewhere that is not going to lend the credibility to your work that it deserves, or allow your work to be viewed favorably by the larger research community. While we're on the subject of the darker side of academic publishing, I also want to touch upon paper mills, which I've alluded to on a few different slides. Paper mills are professional companies that offer paid publishing services to authors. They often operate by using a central email address to impersonate a corresponding author and submit a paper, either containing real or fabricated data, to a journal. Once the paper progresses to peer review, they solicit for authorship positions, often with varying price points per author position on the paper, via social media and targeted email campaigns. They then submit the revised paper with this new set of authors. In other instances, they also pay editors, or more often guest editors on special issues, to submit special issue proposals whereby they aim to gain full control over use of fake reviewers to submit fake reviewer reports and push papers through to acceptance that may not have any business being published. And we'd be remiss in discussing these ethical pitfalls without also providing a warning on the potential consequences. So before we move on to your questions, it is our duty to the scientific community to initiate corrections to the scientific record. When honest or minor mistakes have been identified, we'll probably issue an erratum, which is not a very severe consequence and has very few negative connotations. This is particularly common if the error was introduced by the journal, for instance, by a typesetting error, or it may be a corrigendum if the error was introduced by the author and doesn't change the underlying results or the conclusions within the main manuscript. Most ethical violations that we've discussed today could result in the retraction of the paper. Note that this does not mean that your paper will be removed from search platforms. Rather, when authors open the file, they will see the retraction notice indicating the outcomes of our investigations, and the PDF will remain online, but with a retraction watermark issued across each page. And this is important because it allows researchers and readers to know that there may be issues with the paper and that they should be wary in taking any conclusions from that work. Additionally, depending on the severity and the type of case, including some authorship disputes, we may need to notify your institute and/or funding body for assistance or for awareness. And for more serious infractions, you may no longer be considered eligible to serve on our editorial boards or as a reviewer. So all of this to say that unfortunately, there are people out there who intentionally try to subvert the publication process for their own gain and to avoid scrutiny. So please do be careful when preparing your work for publication, and don't let carelessness delay peer review or worse, hinder your chance of getting accepted. I hope you'll forgive me for ending on a slightly down note. These are some really important points, but I'm hoping that you're all going to be leaving the session, maybe having learned a few tips for safeguarding the integrity of your work. Together, we can protect the scientific record and ensure that the research cycle builds upon validated and trustworthy work. So thank you very much. And now I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you might have. So I'm going to look over to Benny to help me sift through some of the chat and the Q&A, please.
Thank you, Dr. Olivia. Thank you so much for the fantastic and also interesting presentations and related to this research integrity concern, which is very much relevant to our day-to-day research work, particularly for the postgraduate students, as well as the researchers in the university. So now we are open up for Q&A. Please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A box, and I will read through it for Dr. Olivia to address it accordingly. But I think we are already starting to see some of the questions since the beginning of the sessions. Let me read it out.
Thank you. Apologies, my camera doesn't seem to be letting me show my face in the session. Otherwise, I'd be very happy to say hello to you all.
No problems. Do you think that the supervisors that did not supervise well students can be part of authors in the research if the university asks to do so?
That's a really good question. Yes, so we do unfortunately see some authorship disputes where people will allege that maybe someone who should have been very involved in the process of preparing a study or a research manuscript maybe did not actually meet what we would judge to be authorship criteria. I would say if you find yourself in that situation, it may be wise to involve your institute and have that discussion. I mean, when it comes down to it, if a supervisor was not involved in those 4 parts of creating the manuscript, if they were not involved in actively supervising, reviewing the data and results, and drafting that manuscript, they would not qualify for authorship by our journal policies. However, I would caution to say that often when it's the case of, for instance, a PhD student and a supervisor, we do get these disputes which arise after publication if the supervisor disagrees. So it may be easier and prevent some fallout in the long term if you have that discussion with your institute before submitting your paper, if you anticipate that the authorship you're proposing for a paper may be contentious. As a journal editor, we would probably ask for substantiation of who contributed to the study and how. So if you were able to show that you did all of these parts of a paper, with your collaborators, and that the supervisor did not really have a part in that, then the editor may vote to publish the paper without the supervisor on the authorship byline in your favor. But if you expect that the author byline you're proposing is likely to cause problems, it's best to discuss this with your institute first. But I feel for anyone that's in that position.
Thank you, Olivia. The next question from Divian Mohan. I can't seem to comprehend the conflict of interest when it comes to financial interest in terms of grant. So if one conducts the projects with the support of the grant, does he or she has to declare the financial interest with the grant support?
Good question. Thank you, Vivian. Yes, so I think pretty much the vast majority of research will have had some kind of funding to support it. And journal editors are well aware of this. And pretty much any journal policy will require you to disclose any sources of funding available in the work. We would generally consider a funding source, it would not typically be a conflict of interest unless you yourself were benefiting from it. So if that funding was purely used to support the research rather than going into your own pocket, then it's not likely to be something that influences the conclusions of your work. I think most of the time when we see funding bodies, they are not necessarily invested in any particular outcome for that research, and transparently reporting your conclusions is not going to be counter to their aims. It may be different if the person who is, or if the organization that has funded your study is looking specifically for a certain outcome. So potentially, I think the example I gave, if the work was funded by an oil drilling company, then they may have certain motivations in what kind of research they would like to be published. So it really depends whether the funder is likely to benefit financially from the research aims of your paper. If in doubt, please include it in your disclosure statement. The editors and reviewers can always sort of say, we wouldn't consider this a conflict of interest, and you can feel free to remove that before publication. So if in doubt, do say so. But broadly speaking, the average researcher wouldn't need to worry about a conflict of interest from their funding source.
Thank you, Olivia. And there's one interesting question from No Afifa. And she says that she needs to know more explanations on self-plagiarism if the same methodology was used with the same data, but dealing with different research questions.
Yes, this is a great question. And as I said, it can be a bit of a gray area when it comes to self-plagiarism. Although it's often called self-plagiarism, I often prefer the term redundant publication, because I think self-plagiarism is generally seen as less severe or less problematic than copying someone else's work. But broadly speaking, if you have documented certain methodologies in previous papers and you use them in your onward work, it's probably fine. It's not going to be a large problem. Ideally, you would maybe tweak the language a little bit so it wasn't completely a reused block section of text. But if it's the same methods that you've used before, then that's fine. And especially if you're using it to address a new research question, that wouldn't typically be a problem. If you were reusing the method from a previous paper in a methods paper, by which I mean a paper that is purely presenting a method and that is the kind of the source of novelty in the new paper, it wouldn't be acceptable for that to have been reused from a previous paper. But if you were conducting a new study that was an original research article for which the methodology was not the primary novelty of the paper, you probably won't have to worry about reusing sections of your methods. And again, if you have any questions, you can always note this in the cover letter and sort of let the editor know this methodology has been used before. You should also cite that method in your methods section. So if it is the same as your previous paper, sort of saying this work was conducted using this particular process as previously documented in ... that would be the appropriate way to do it.
Thank you, Olivia. And there was 2 questions from Rabia. Number 1, every journal can accept conceptual paper or any specific journal accepting? And number 2, how can we find which journal is right or wrong?
I'm sorry, Benny, would you mind repeating the first part of that question? I'm not sure I caught it.
You mean number 1?
Yes, please.
I think Rabia is asking, is it every journal can accept conceptual papers or any specific journal are only accepting the conceptual paper?
So I'm not entirely sure what is meant by a conceptual paper, but certainly most journals will have within their guide for authors what types of papers they would accept, and that might include original research articles or review papers, perspective articles. Perhaps that's what we're getting at a little bit here, things that don't necessarily contain original research or literature review. So it should say so in the guide for authors. But again, if you have any questions, I would really encourage you to reach out to the editorial office and sort of say, hey, I've got this idea for a paper coming up. It would take the form of a conceptual paper, a perspectives paper, an opinion, a letter to the editor, something like that. Is this something that the journal would consider? And they'll be able to guide you on that. And I would say actually often, even journals that don't necessarily say they publish these sorts of papers may do so on exception if they think it's a topic that's really of interest to their readership. So do get in touch with the editor to have that question. The second part of that question was about finding what journal is right for you. So I believe there is a website called Journal Finder that Elsevier offers, in which you can search based on your field of research, what type of article you're preparing. I think you can also include filters such as impact factor, which we appreciate is important to a lot of researchers, so you can look for journals within certain windows. And you can also, I think, post in your abstract, and it can search based on your abstract to find a journal that is a good fit for you. So if you're really sort of not sure where to start, I often recommend that. Otherwise, I'd really recommend looking at the reference list of the paper you're preparing and seeing where your co-authors and where your cited work has been published. Because if your work is based on their ideas, it's likely that it's going to be of interest to those journals' readership as well. I hope that answers the question.
Yep. The next one, can Norway's researchers publish in Elsevier Journal? Or I think what he meant was early career researchers publish in Elsevier Journal.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we're very fortunate to have a broad range of journals. I don't think any journals would look on an early career researcher as being a negative. We get great research comes from everywhere. It can come from, really established people in the field, and it can come from large scale labs, or it can come from anyone that has a good idea or that has found something interesting. So absolutely, being an early career researcher is definitely not a limitation. No, not a problem at all. We very much welcome your work.
And the next question, I think, is very much relevant to AI. And Farah is asking how she can acknowledge AI in language editing. Is it in the acknowledge section?
Yes, so I think, as I mentioned, we now have a tool on Elsevier journals. So when you're submitting your manuscript, you should be prompted with a question asking if you have used generative AI tools in your work, and if so, how. And it pre-populates with some text that will say something along the lines of, I, as an author, can declare that we have used this particular tool. And I think it requires you to say what tool you have used, what version of the tool has been used, because that can implicate specifically how that tool works, and what sections of the manuscript it has been used for and what purpose. So I would say, for instance, I have used let's say ChatGPT as an easy example for the process of reviewing quality of language within my manuscript. It would say which version of ChatGPT, 4.0 or whatever, and I would say I've used this on all sections of the manuscript to review language. And as an author, I can declare that I have read through the manuscript having used this tool and can verify that the content is complete, correct, free from bias. So you'll be prompted with this disclosure statement when you submit your journal to an Elsevier journal. If you submit to other journals, then I'd still recommend using a similar kind of statement within your work. And as mentioned, if you're using those tools for the purpose of language editing, then that shouldn't prohibit you publishing your work in our journals. We just want to know how it's been used so that we can verify that it's been done mindfully by the authors.
The next one, if an author passed away and contributed in the work, how can we include this person as part of co-authors?
Oh gosh, this is a very good question. And we see a few cases like this within the team because it's not one that has a set right answer. Unfortunately, my apologies to anyone in this position, of course. It can be a really, really tough situation to resolve, and one that we always want to approach with a good amount of sensitivity for everyone related to it. So if one of the authors has passed away, but they were a substantial contributor to the work, it may be potentially that they were not able to view the final version of the manuscript, or were not able to partake in drafting or revising it. So if they haven't met those basic authorship criteria, we would generally say that it will probably be best to include them in the acknowledgement section of a paper and sort of say, Dr. So-and-so participated in the manuscript by offering, XYZ contributions. If they did partake in those parts of the manuscript, I think the fourth part of those authorship criteria, sort of saying that you need to be held responsible for the work and able to respond to ethics queries, of course, that's not something that someone deceased is going to be able to take part in. However, I would say if they have contributed to the work in all other aspects, that they did see the final version before it was published, they did contribute to the data analysis, and they did partake in reviewing the work, it could be that they really should be credited as an author. If you find yourself in this position, the key things to note are that the journal will probably require that you have permission from either the deceased author's next of kin or an executor of their estate, who can sign the copyright transfer agreements on behalf of that author. If you can find someone who can sign those agreements, then the journal will permit their being included as an author. Getting those signed can be really difficult, especially if it's someone that's deceased quite recently. It can be very difficult to, navigate those sorts of conversations with family members at a very difficult time. So I would say if this happens, please keep in touch with the editorial office, let them know what's going on. If there are going to be any delays, let them know why that is. And it may be that if those signatures aren't available, then you could potentially include that author in the acknowledgements, but say something along the lines of, Dr. So-and-so contributed to this work in the capacity of an author, but unfortunately passed away prior to the manuscript being published, but we would like to acknowledge equal contribution to this work in XYZ capacity. And also, if you are able to obtain those signatures after the fact, then we can always publish a corrigendum or an erratum to the work to say that that person has now been included in the author byline. So it's a really difficult situation. We try not to say there's any one way that things should be carried out, because things can be very subject to change in each individual scenario, but do keep in discussion with the journal and they'll be able to guide you through it.
Thank you, Olivia. So due to the time constraint, I think I will pick another 3 to 4 more questions for Olivia to answer. And Are you okay with it, Dr.
Yes,
Olivia?
I
So
have time. Thanks, Benny.
I found one very interesting question that I think Olivia can answer it. Can we give authorship to the one who is supposed to support our article fees?
Yes. So if someone has supported the work in the way of providing funding, it is something. So if you look at the credit statement, it will give you a kind of a vocabulary of the various ways that someone can contribute to a paper. That might include contributing funding, supervising, data analysis, writing, reviewing. There's lots of different ways in which someone can contribute to a work. However, having contributed to the work by something on the credit authorship list does not necessarily qualify you for an author. I would say that Elsevier policy says that authorship is always determined by that ICJME criteria, those 4 bullet points of contributing to the work, contributing to reviewing, contributing to reviewing the final version of the manuscript, and being able to take responsibility for those findings if ethical queries arise. And usually, if someone has only participated in the work by providing funding, that doesn't typically qualify for authorship. That would probably be someone that's acknowledged either in the funding section or in the acknowledgements section.
The next questions, I think it is also quite important by Vivian again. And I have seen some author having published a paper that is correct. That is a correction to a previously published paper. So does that cause duplications? And besides, in what circumstances does one publishes a corrected paper, and why wasn't it addressed prior to publishing? Would love an enlightenment to this.
Interesting. Yes, so corrections certainly occur. So if you see a correction, or depending on which publishing house the work is with, it might be called a correction, it might be called an erratum, it might be called a corrigendum. If you see these attached to a publication post-publication, it means that something was found after the work was published that needed to be corrected. So for whatever reason, the reviewers didn't catch it, or the authors didn't notice it, or maybe something has changed. Maybe someone found out after the fact that they mislabeled their data files, something like that. And usually when these corrections are issued, it's because an error has been found, often an honest error, I would say. We are less lenient if we think that people have intentionally created errors within their manuscript. But if a small and honest error has been found, we would issue a correction to that part of the manuscript, and it would be attached by this notice that would be called a corrigendum. And that would say, for instance, the authors discovered that they had inadvertently mislabeled one of their test tubes during this experiment, and that actually in this figure, this panel corresponds to this experimental sample. The authors apologize that this has happened, and they might provide a new version of the figure and or the text to supplement it. Usually when these corrigenda or corrections are included, it's because the error affects a very small part of the paper. It doesn't affect the overall conclusions or the results in a substantial way. If an error is found that is more substantial, the work may need to be retracted and submitted anew. So I would say if you see a correction, that's usually why, and there are all sorts of things that can lead to corrections being necessary. Does it create redundancy? We would say no, because we see the corrected notice as being very distinct from the original manuscript. So the original file for that manuscript would be the manuscript as it was submitted and published with the journal. The PDF for the correction would just be the notice explaining what had happened. So although they both will be linked by the same DOI link, and they'll be sort of connected to each other so that they're very easily discovered by readers as being related to one another, the content is very different. The corrigendum or the retraction PDF would say, this is the error that has occurred. This is the replacement information that readers should be aware of.
Okay, the last questions for this webinar. Can you share what is the limit to use AI in writing, and can we use it to just generate ideas only?
Very good question. I would say that there aren't hard limits in the extent to which it could be used. I mean, for instance, if you were using it to review the language quality of your article, you could use that in all sections of the manuscript. And although you'd need to disclose how it's been used, you know, if you use it in the introduction and the methods and the conclusions and the discussions, as long as it's being used appropriately, that's not a problem. So it's very much not about the extent to which it is being used with regards to how much of the manuscript it is covering. It's very much about how it is being used. So again, as I say, generative AI tools can be used for reasons of language clarity only. I'm sorry, what was the second part of this question, Benny? I lost my train of thought.
Hold on, yeah.
Thank you.
Does it mean that is AI can be used for idea generations only?
Thank you.
Yep.
Yes, so AI should not be used for generating new ideas and concepts. The way we view it is that these tools pull from various sources that are not necessarily novel. It will pull from various sources online. And so using it to generate new concepts and ideas is going to disable you from being able to credit the people who originally had those ideas. It should be, it can be used to correct grammar, correct phrasing, but it shouldn't be used to generate hypotheses. It shouldn't be used to draw insights or conclusions from your data. Those are very much tasks that we feel should be ascribed to the authors of the paper, because they're the ones that have the scientific expertise to verify whether it is correct, complete, and unbiased.
Thank you, Dr. Olivia, on this Q&A sessions. So I have also seen other questions mostly on APC, on open access, on subscription-based submission. So I would suggest all of you to go to Elsevier Journal Finders that will give you more insight of which journals are having hybrid option and which are just go open access to just pay for APC for publishing. And there are many options for you all to choose based on your suitability as well as financial conditions on the research. So as I mentioned, due to the time constraints, we can't address all the Q&A accordingly one by one, and we have picked the most relevant one to be answered by the speaker today. And thank you so much for your time, Dr. Olivia, for having you today to speak on research integrity and also the top 10 pitfalls that related to this research integrity that faced by all the researchers in Malaysia. Thank you so much.
Benny. It's absolutely been my pleasure. Thank you all so much for providing such great questions. You're keeping me on my toes very much. And I also just took a quick look in the Q&A, and thank you to all of you who also participated in some of those questions and scenarios during the presentation. I hope you all got something out of it. And as Benny said, please do reach out to journal editorial offices if you have any further questions, or look me up on LinkedIn. I'm also very happy if you have questions about ethics for you to contact me there.
Thank you so much. And for those who are asking for recording as well as the materials of the slides, please reach out to your respective librarian, and your librarian can reach out to us to request for the recording and the slide, and that will be distributed out through your respective university librarian. Thank you so much. Thank you for the participants that joining us this afternoon for this webinar on research integrity. Thank you so much. Have a good day and good luck for your research career.
Thanks, Benny. All the best, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.